Hey friends, let me share something with you. There was a point when I found myself in a financial bind, the kind of situation almost everyone runs into sooner or later. I got hit with a parking ticket at exactly the wrong moment, and there was almost no room left in my budget. That unexpected expense felt much heavier than it should have, simply because the timing was so bad. That is the kind of moment when Dave, the sponsor of today's video, can be useful. Dave is a banking app designed to give people a little more breathing room when money gets tight. After downloading Dave, eligible members may be able to access up to $500 in 5 minutes or less. There are no credit checks and no late fees. With Dave's Extra Cash account, eligible members can access the money they need without interest and settle the balance later. Whether the need is groceries, gas, rent, or another everyday expense that cannot wait until the next paycheck, Dave is designed to help make that gap easier to manage. Millions of people have downloaded the Dave app, and over the years, the service says it has helped members avoid more than $2.5 billion in overdraft fees. So, when an unexpected expense puts you in a tough spot, try not to panic. You can learn more by visiting dave.com/letsread. Eligible members may be able to access up to $500 in 5 minutes or less. There are no credit checks and no late fees. Terms, eligibility requirements, and instant transfer fees may apply. Banking services are provided by Evolve Bank and Trust, a member of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, let's move into something far darker. A man in his late 50s from southern Florida sat down at his computer and opened a specialized web browser. Using privacy software known as Tor, he could browse ordinary websites with a high degree of anonymity, while also entering hidden services that most internet users would never encounter. Once he believed his identity was concealed, the man began uploading the files needed to build a website of his own. But unlike people using hidden networks for financial fraud, illegal marketplaces, or stolen information, this man had a different and deeply disturbing purpose. For this retelling, we'll call him Walter Kessler. Walter created a site called The Playpen. His goal was to build an enormous collection of illegal child exploitation material and create a community around it. Not long after the site appeared, it came to the attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation as part of a major international effort against online child exploitation. Investigators later said they had been aware of the site very early, but identifying the physical location of the servers and then connecting those servers to the person running them took time. A major break came through international law enforcement cooperation. Investigators in Europe received information from a member of the public who had stumbled across something horrifying while using the internet. According to the account, the person had tried to enter the numerical address of another computer and apparently mistyped it. Instead of reaching the intended destination, the person landed on a page containing a vast collection of illegal material involving children, all under the banner of The Playpen. That discovery gave investigators a crucial lead. Eventually, federal agents traced the site's infrastructure to a home in Florida. During an early morning raid, they identified the site's operator as Walter Kessler. Faced with the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, Walter agreed to cooperate. He gave investigators broad access to his computers storage devices, and digital records. For weeks, agents examined backup files and account information connected to the site. Walter's devices contained an extraordinary amount of evidence about the people who had used, managed, and contributed to the community. But when investigators finished seizing the original operator's equipment, they did something that surprised almost everyone who later learned about it. They did not immediately shut the playpen down. Instead, the Federal Bureau of Investigation secretly took control of the site and continued operating it for a limited period. Agents tried to preserve the appearance that Walter was still in charge. They reportedly imitated his writing habits and communication style, so users would believe nothing had changed. During that covert period, the site's membership reportedly increased significantly as more people arrived from across hidden online networks. Behind the scenes, however, cybercrime investigators were using a network investigative technique designed to identify visitors whose anonymity would otherwise have hidden them. The technique delivered identifying information from computers that accessed the site. Investigators then used those leads, often in cooperation with agencies in other countries, to locate suspects. By the time the operation ended, authorities around the world had arrested close to 1,000 people, connected in various ways to the network. Several high-ranking users were convicted quickly, and the investigation contributed to the identification and rescue of many exploited children. When the scale of the arrests became public, many people celebrated the operation as a major victory. Then more details emerged. Journalists reported that the Federal Bureau of Investigation itself had continued operating the site after arresting its creator. That revelation triggered intense public debate. Civil liberties advocates, including the Electronic Frontier Foundation, questioned whether law enforcement had crossed a line by keeping such a harmful platform online, even for investigative purposes. Critics argued that the government had not merely observed criminal activity, but had temporarily become the operator of the very site it was trying to destroy. Some critics also allege that during government control, the site became faster and easier to use. The Federal Bureau of Investigation defended its decision. Officials argued that continuing the operation allowed them to identify dangerous offenders who might otherwise have remained hidden. They pointed to the large number of arrests, successful prosecutions, and children located through the investigation. To supporters of the operation, those results mattered enormously, but the legal questions did not disappear. One major issue involved the scope of the original search authority. Investigators had obtained judicial permission tied to a specific federal district. Their investigative software, however, was capable of collecting identifying information from visitors regardless of where those visitors were physically located. That difference became important in court. In at least one case, a defendant successfully challenged evidence after a judge concluded that the investigative method had exceeded the geographic scope of the warrant. As a result, the government's evidence could not be used in the way prosecutors had intended. To an outside observer, that might sound like a technical mistake, but federal warrants are not casual guidelines. They define the legal boundaries of government searches, and experienced investigators are expected to understand those boundaries. That led defense attorneys and civil liberties advocates to ask a difficult question. Why would experienced federal investigators use a technique that could jeopardize cases they had worked so hard to build? One assistant federal defender, whom we'll call Martin Adler, argued that archived records showed the site had continued distributing enormous amounts of illegal content while the government controlled it. He cited user messages suggesting that the site was functioning smoothly during the covert operation. Years later, a federal appellate court considered whether the government's conduct had crossed the constitutional line. The court acknowledged how troubling the operation was. It recognized that, while the government controlled the platform, illegal material remained accessible to a very large number of users, and investigators could not fully control what those users might do with it. The judges described the government's conduct as coming close to outrageous. Even so, they refused to throw out the charges. The court's reasoning was uncomfortable but practical. In a perfect world, law enforcement would never need to operate a criminal platform, even temporarily. But the judges also recognized that hidden online communities can disappear and reappear quickly under new names, with new operators and on new servers. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had made a calculated decision. Investigators believed the chance to identify offenders, rescue victims, and dismantle a global network outweighed the dangers of keeping the site active for a short period. And that is what makes this case so difficult to think about. The operation led to arrests. It led to convictions. It helped authorities identify children who were being harmed. Those outcomes cannot be dismissed. At the same time, the method used to reach those outcomes created its own serious moral and legal concerns. The case leaves behind a question that has no easy answer. When authorities are trying to stop something profoundly harmful, how far should they be allowed to go before the method itself becomes part of the problem? That question would appear again in a very different case, one centered not on a hidden website, but on the uncertain boundary between a person's darkest thoughts and the moment those thoughts become a real plan. A young police officer named Adrian Mercer lived with his elderly father in Queens, New York. Police work consumed most of his life. His shifts were long and exhausting, and when he came home, he often had little energy left for anything beyond sleep. On his days off, he was usually too drained to socialize. Adrian wanted a relationship, but he felt as though his work schedule left him no realistic way to meet someone. So he turned to online dating. That was how he met Claire Bennett, an elementary school teacher who had recently settled in East Harlem. They connected quickly. The relationship felt easy at first. Claire later remembered Adrian as funny, attentive, and courteous. Before long, they moved into a small apartment together. Then Claire became pregnant. She expected Adrian to be surprised, maybe nervous, but ultimately happy. Instead, his first reaction frightened her. He repeatedly said that he could not handle what was happening. After he calmed down, though, he called Claire's parents and assured them he would take responsibility. That change in attitude gave Claire hope, but it did not last. She later said Adrian seemed to pull away so gradually that, at first, she barely noticed. His attention faded. His emotional distance grew. Then, after the family moved into a larger apartment, Adrian proposed marriage. Claire accepted. They married, with their infant daughter Nora becoming the emotional center of the day. For a while, marriage seemed to bring Adrian closer to his family again. But the improvement was temporary. Claire said he rarely helped with the baby. When he returned home after late shifts, he often stayed awake, deep into the night, playing games or browsing the internet. As far as Claire knew, Adrian spent much of his online time reading sports pages and police forums. Then one day, she walked into his office and noticed something strange. Adrian was rapidly deleting his browser history. Claire had enough experience with computers to recognize what she was seeing. The moment Adrian noticed her in the room, he minimized the window and acted as though he had been doing something else. The moment passed, but Claire could not forget it. Curiosity turned into unease. Later, while Adrian was away, Claire entered his office and opened his computer. Near the bottom of the screen, she noticed 2 image files. She opened them. What she saw disturbed her deeply. The images involved adults, but they were far more violent and unsettling than anything she had expected to find. Claire understood the difference between fantasy content and ordinary intimacy. What frightened her was the apparent death and cruelty depicted in the images. For a long time, Claire had wondered whether Adrian's emotional distance meant he no longer found her attractive. Now she realized the problem might have nothing to do with her. She sent him a short message. They needed to talk. When Adrian came home, he looked nervous. During the confrontation, he broke down and cried. He told Claire that his interest in disturbing material was connected to stress, and that he had used increasingly dark online content as a way to escape from his real life. He promised to seek professional help. He promised he would stop visiting those sites. For a while, Claire hoped the confrontation had finally opened a door between them. Adrian was talking. He was admitting things. He seemed vulnerable in a way she had rarely seen. But the images stayed in her mind. She could not shake the feeling that she had only seen the surface. Eventually, fear overcame hesitation. While Adrian was away at work, Claire installed monitoring software on his computer after seeking advice online about how to understand what was happening. What she found the next day changed everything. The websites themselves were disturbing enough. The private messages were worse. Claire began reading Adrian's conversations with people he had met online. Then she saw photographs of herself, photographs of her friends, photographs of women they both knew. In those conversations, Adrian and several anonymous users described violent fantasies involving kidnapping, restraint, murder, and cannibalism. Claire found messages in which strangers discussed harming her personally. She saw Adrian respond to those fantasies as though he were participating in a shared plan. The language was not vague. It was detailed enough to make her afraid for her life. As Claire continued reading, she discovered that the fantasies did not stop with her. Adrian had collected images of numerous women and placed them into hidden folders. Some were public figures. Others were members of Claire's family, friends, co-workers, or women Adrian had known personally. The files contained comments describing violent intentions towards some of them. Claire no longer knew where fantasy ended and genuine danger began. That uncertainty was enough. She took Nora and traveled to stay with her parents in Nevada. Adrian did not yet understand what she had discovered. While Claire was away, he continued searching online for information related to abduction, violence, and cannibalism. Investigators later said he also maintained hidden folders containing photographs of women he had discussed harming. For Claire, the risk had become impossible to ignore. She went to the police. Soon afterward, Adrian was at home on a day off when his phone rang. The caller said Adrian's car had been badly damaged and suggested he come outside. Adrian rushed to the parking lot. His car was untouched. As he turned back toward the building, 3 men in suits approached him. They knew his name. They identified themselves as federal agents. After questioning him, they arrested him. Adrian was charged with conspiracy to kidnap Claire. Investigators began assembling the digital evidence. There was a great deal of it. Emails, private messages, searches, photographs, database records, and conversations with other users all became part of the case. One detail made the allegations especially troubling. Adrian was a police officer. Some of his messages suggested that he had considered using the trust associated with his badge and position to make potential victims feel safe. A federal prosecutor later argued that this made the case especially serious. A police officer is entrusted with authority for the purpose of protecting people. The government believed Adrian had contemplated using that authority for the opposite purpose. By the time the trial began, newspapers had given Adrian a sensational nickname connected to the cannibalistic fantasies found in his messages. The public reaction was immediate and intense, but inside the courtroom, the legal question was more complicated than the headlines suggested. Adrian had not kidnapped anyone. He had not murdered anyone. Investigators did not find a victim being held captive, a completed abduction attempt, or physical evidence showing that an attack was about to happen. The prosecution argued that Adrian's online fantasies had progressed into an actual criminal agreement. The defense argued that the messages were revolting, disturbing, and humiliating, but still fantasy. That distinction became the heart of the case. One of the websites Adrian used most frequently was called the Dark Fetish Network. Federal investigators estimated that the community had tens of thousands of unique users. Its homepage contained a disclaimer stating that the material was fantasy only. But investigators believed some users had interests that extended beyond roleplay. Adrian joined under a username that openly referenced his violent fixation. He communicated with many people but stayed especially close to three. For this retelling, we'll call them Grant Harlow, Malcolm Rourke, and Farid Rahman. Grant was a young mechanic from New Jersey. Malcolm was a British man who used the screen name Moody Blues. Farid traveled between several countries and regularly participated in Adrian's private conversations. Adrian sent Grant a photograph of a teacher named Tessa Langford, who was close to Claire. The accompanying message suggested a price in exchange for access to her. Grant tried to negotiate. Adrian responded that he was taking a serious risk and insisted that if anything happened, the woman could never be traced back to him. To prosecutors, this sounded like more than fantasy. To the defense, it was another example of online role play in which participants deliberately tried to sound convincing. Adrian also exchanged messages with Farid about taking Claire on an overseas trip, where she could be ambushed and killed. In another set of conversations, Adrian expressed intense hostility toward a former college friend named Serena Caldwell. He wrote that the matter felt personal and described violent fantasies about making her suffer. No one was able to establish exactly why Adrian held such anger towards Serena. What investigators could establish was that he had thought about her for years and repeatedly returned to her in his online conversations. Adrian also communicated frequently with Malcolm Rourke. Malcolm claimed to have access to an isolated property and described equipment that could be used in grotesque fantasies involving murder and cannibalism. Adrian sent him photographs of female friends and co-workers. Eventually, Malcolm focused on a woman we'll call Marissa Keene. The two men exchanged increasingly disturbing messages about abducting and killing her. At one point, Adrian sent Malcolm a document that read like a fictional blueprint for an abduction. It described the kinds of preparation, concealment, and evidence avoidance they imagined would be necessary. Investigators treated the document as highly significant. The defense argued that its theatrical level of detail actually supported the opposite conclusion, because the men repeatedly wrote elaborate plans that were never carried out. Then investigators found something more concrete. Adrian had used a law enforcement database to look up personal information about several women he discussed online. Among them was Serena Caldwell, Marissa Keene, and an old school acquaintance named Eliza Hartwell. The records contained basic identifying information. They also contained home addresses. That mattered because Adrian had moved beyond merely looking at public photographs. He had used restricted government resources to access private information about women who appeared in his violent fantasies. In one message, Adrian described seeing Marissa at a reunion and commented on her in language that deeply alarmed investigators. Later, he and Malcolm discussed another woman, Paige Merritt, whom Adrian may have encountered through an alumni social media group. Adrian's focus shifted constantly. One day, one woman seemed to consume his attention. Soon afterward, someone else did. Then he returned again to Serena. At one point, he wrote that, if she lived closer, she might already be gone. That kind of statement became central to the prosecution's case. Yet when agents searched Adrian's apartment, they found an important absence. There was no physical evidence showing that an abduction was immediately underway. Although Adrian had bragged online about preparing certain substances and equipment, investigators did not find the materials he claimed to have assembled. They did not find a captive victim. They did not find a hidden room prepared for a kidnapping. They did not find clear evidence that one of his elaborate online scenarios had advanced to the final stage of execution. For the defense, that absence mattered enormously. One of Adrian's attorneys, Russell Dane, pointed out that the messages repeatedly named proposed dates for crimes. Those dates came and went. Nothing happened. Then new dates were proposed. Again, nothing happened. The defense argued that the pattern was not the behavior of a man executing a plan. It was the behavior of someone repeatedly extending a fantasy. The problem was that Adrian's fantasies were so detailed, so personal, and so disturbing that asking a jury to view them as harmless imagination was nearly impossible. Russell later acknowledged the difficulty. To defend Adrian, the legal team had to convince jurors that a man who had written extensively about violent crimes, collected photographs of real women, accessed restricted information, and discussed possible logistics with other people still had no true intention of acting. That was a very heavy burden. A prominent forensic psychiatrist, whom we'll call Dr. Everett Sloan, was asked to evaluate Adrian. Dr. Sloan had experience examining notorious offenders and had spent years studying the difference between fantasy, compulsion, personality disorder, and criminal intent. He interviewed Adrian at length. His task was not to decide whether the fantasies were disgusting. Everyone agreed that they were. His task was to assess whether Adrian truly wanted to carry them out. Dr. Sloan reviewed Adrian's psychological records from his police career, including standardized personality testing. Those records did not show the kind of clinical psychopathology the psychiatrist expected to see in someone preparing to become a violent predator. That did not prove Adrian was harmless, but it complicated the picture. During the interviews, Adrian discussed the origins of his fixation. He remembered becoming fascinated, while still young, by a scene in a popular comedy film in which a glamorous woman was restrained. The image stayed with him. He returned to that scene repeatedly. As he grew older, he began seeking increasingly dark, fictional material online. By the end of high school, he was visiting websites built around violent fantasy scenarios. Yet people who knew Adrian in ordinary life generally did not describe him as violent. He was quiet. He was often respectful toward women. There were no widely available accounts of him physically attacking or threatening people before the federal case. That contrast fascinated Dr. Sloan. The psychiatrist said the online messages were undeniably disturbing and acknowledged that some evidence could be interpreted as movement toward action. But in his professional opinion, Adrian still appeared several steps removed from the kind of person who was actually preparing to commit the crimes he described. Dr. Sloan explained that frightening thoughts alone do not automatically establish criminal intention. To assess future danger, he looked for patterns of behavior, escalating real-world aggression, repeated boundary violations, and other indicators that a person was moving from fantasy into action. In Adrian's case, he said those indicators were not clearly present. The prosecution strongly disagreed. During closing arguments, Adrian cried as his attorneys described how his online behavior had destroyed his marriage, ended his police career, separated him from his daughter, and exposed his private life to the world. The defense did not ask the jury to approve of him. They did not call the messages normal. They said the conversations were ugly, offensive, and deeply disturbing. But they argued that being disturbed by someone's thoughts is not the same as proving a criminal conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution responded by focusing on action. Adrian had not merely written fictional scenes, they argued. He had looked up real women in restricted databases. He had discussed real locations. He had shared real photographs. He had communicated with real people. He had searched for personal information. A prosecutor named Daniel Cross asked the jury to imagine learning that the chef at their favorite restaurant spent every night fantasizing in detail about poisoning customers and discussing possible methods with others. Would they keep eating there? The point was emotional but clear. At what point does repeated fantasy become a warning that cannot responsibly be ignored? After deliberating, the jury returned a guilty verdict on the conspiracy charge. Adrian looked stunned. His family believed the verdict was a terrible injustice. One juror, whom we'll call Marcus Bell, later defended the decision. He said the jury believed Adrian's fantasies were becoming progressively more realistic, as though each new conversation had to move closer to the real world to satisfy him. In the juror's view, Adrian was no longer simply imagining. He was gradually testing the boundary between imagination and action. Adrian received an extremely severe sentence on the conspiracy conviction, along with an additional sentence for unauthorized access to restricted law enforcement databases. His mother became one of the strongest voices supporting an appeal, and eventually that appeal succeeded. A federal judge overturned the conspiracy conviction, concluding that the evidence better supported Adrian's claim that he had been engaged in fantasy roleplay rather than a genuine agreement to commit kidnapping. By then, Adrian had already spent a substantial period in prison. His remaining conviction for unauthorized database access was effectively satisfied by the time he had already served, and he was released. Afterward, Adrian spoke publicly about the case and wrote a book presenting his version of what had happened. The book described the experience as a warning about what can happen when disturbing thoughts, private fantasy, and criminal intent are treated as though they are automatically the same thing. But Adrian's release did not end the wider investigation. Federal agents continued examining members of the dark fetish network. Grant Harlow, the young mechanic who had communicated with Adrian, was later investigated at his home. Authorities found illegal material involving children on his computer. His wife publicly defended him in a way that shocked many observers, saying that people in a marriage sometimes have to accept deeply troubling flaws in one another. Grant then began cooperating with federal investigators. His cooperation contributed to investigations involving 2 other men, including a police official and a former school employee who had previously faced allegations involving students. Agents monitored communications, assumed online identities, and arranged meetings designed to test whether suspects would take real-world action. In one case, a suspect arrived carrying a collection of items that investigators believed could be associated with a planned violent offense. That case demonstrated the exact distinction that had made Adrian's prosecution so difficult. Some people wrote horrifying things online and never acted. Others took concrete steps. Malcolm Rourke, The British man Adrian knew as Moody Blues was later arrested in a joint investigation involving British and American authorities. He was convicted in connection with predatory conduct involving a minor and admitted to other serious offenses, including an earlier incident in which he used a chemical-soaked cloth against a female acquaintance. A judge described his conduct as abhorrent, shocking, and dangerous. Psychiatrists did not conclude that mental illness explained his behavior. Malcolm tried to dismiss his online messages as stupidity and dark humor. But unlike Adrian, Malcolm already had a history of real predatory conduct. That distinction matters. Adrian's case became famous because he was convicted largely on the theory that his words, searches, database use, and communications proved an agreement to commit a crime. The conviction was later overturned because the judge concluded that the evidence did not sufficiently separate fantasy from intent. Malcolm's case involved conduct that had already crossed into the real world. That is the uncomfortable center of the entire story. A person's thoughts can be frightening. Their fantasies can be repulsive. Their private conversations can reveal parts of them that family and friends never imagined existed. But criminal law cannot simply punish every terrible thought. At the same time, society cannot ignore warning signs just because someone uses the word fantasy. The challenge is determining when imagination becomes preparation. Dr. Sloan once summarized the issue in a simple way. Wanting, imagining, or talking about something does not automatically mean a person will do it. That is true. But it is also true that real crimes often begin as thoughts. Some violent offenders spend years imagining what they eventually carry out. Some rehearse ideas privately. Some seek communities that reinforce them. Some collect information. Some test boundaries. And some never move beyond fantasy at all. So where is the line? There may not be one single line that applies to everyone. Intent is not visible. It must be inferred from behavior. That is why courts examine context, actions, preparation, capability, opportunity, and evidence of agreement. Adrian's case frightened people because it forced them to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Human beings can think things they would never do. They can write things they would never say aloud. They can enter private fantasy worlds that would horrify everyone who knows them. The law must protect people from genuine threats without turning private thought itself into a crime. And sometimes, even after a trial, an appeal, expert testimony, and years of public debate, reasonable people can still disagree about where that boundary should be. In another part of the world, a senior Australian police officer sat in an office reviewing a huge collection of photographic evidence. For this retelling, we'll call him Senior Constable Marcus Ellery. The work was slow, draining, and deeply disturbing. The images documented the abuse and exploitation of children, many of them extremely young. There were not a few photographs, but thousands. The person responsible had taken great care to hide identifying features. Faces were concealed. Distinctive marks were avoided. Anything that might make recognition easier seemed to have been deliberately kept out of view. At least that is what the offender believed. Marcus kept studying the images. Then he noticed something tiny. On one finger, close to the edge of the fingernail, there was a small dark freckle. It would have been easy to miss. But once Marcus saw it, he began checking other photographs. The same mark appeared again and again. The discovery suggested that many images thought to involve different masked offenders might actually show the same man. A tiny freckle had become a potential identifier. That detail would play an important role in a major international investigation into one of the largest online child exploitation communities operating through hidden networks. The operation involved law enforcement agencies from several countries. In Australia, A specialist team known as Task Force Argos took a leading role. Investigators believed the person operating the site was Australian and probably lived in the southern part of the country, but they did not know his name. They knew only the short username he used online, Surf. An assistant police commissioner, whom we'll call Paul Redford, later recalled receiving a call from Task Force Argos. The message was simple. Investigators believed they had a potential target somewhere in his jurisdiction. They did not yet know who the person was. They did not know where he lived. They knew only the username. The wider investigation had begun years earlier, after a man in Europe was arrested in connection with child exploitation. Evidence from that case suggested that the site's owner might be operating from South Australia. Police shifted their attention toward the region. They arrested a high-ranking member of the site living elsewhere in Australia and initially hoped he might be Surf. He was not, but he confirmed something important. Surf was Australian, and he was believed to be operating from the south. Another major break came when police in the Netherlands raided the home of a suspected offender and seized electronic devices. Investigators discovered that the suspect had access to the hidden website. They obtained login credentials and used them to study the platform from the inside. One thing quickly stood out. A large percentage of the illegal images appeared to have been created using the same make and model of compact digital camera. That suggested a single source was responsible for a huge portion of the site's original material. The investigators now had several clues: an Australian operator, a southern location, a username, a specific camera pattern, and a distinctive physical mark. Task Force Argos began searching the wider internet for other people using the name Surf. The work took time. Eventually, investigators found an account on a public forum for four-wheel drive enthusiasts. The user was also called Surf. The account discussed tires, suspension, off-road driving, and vehicle setup in great detail. At first, that might have meant nothing. Surf was not an unusual word, but investigators noticed something else. The writing style looked remarkably familiar. The spelling habits, the sentence structure, the tone, the way the user argued. It closely resembled the person communicating on the hidden site. Investigators began reviewing thousands of old posts. Many links were broken. Then one link still worked. It opened an image of a pickup truck. The vehicle's registration plate was visible. Police ran the plate through official records. A name appeared. For this retelling, we'll call him Darren Whitmore. The background check changed the urgency of the case immediately. Darren had spent years working around children and young people through volunteer programs. Even more alarming, he was employed by a government child protection department. That meant he had legitimate access to children who were already vulnerable. Investigators now faced a terrible dilemma. They wanted an airtight case. A rushed arrest might alert other offenders, destroy evidence, or leave victims unidentified. But every day they waited created the possibility that more children could be harmed. Task Force Argos began gathering as much evidence as possible. As they dug deeper, they found another disturbing piece of information. At an earlier point, an anonymous person had contacted Darren's employer and reported an inappropriate comment involving a child connected to his work. Darren had been suspended while the matter was reviewed. He denied wrongdoing. The investigation did not produce enough evidence to justify further action, and he was allowed to return to work. For the officers now investigating him, learning that history was sickening, they believed Darren represented an immediate danger. Still, they needed proof strong enough to survive court. That was when the images of Darren's hands became crucial. One officer received the unusual task of collecting publicly available photographs in which Darren's hands were visible. The investigator cropped the images, enlarged them, and enhanced details. The team was doing the same with other possible suspects. Faces could be hidden. Hands were harder to disguise completely. Marcus Ellery reviewed the enhanced images. Then he saw it, a small dark freckle beside a fingernail. the same mark he had noticed in the abuse photographs. The connection was devastating. The man police suspected of running one of the world's largest online child exploitation communities was not merely distributing illegal material. Investigators believed he was directly involved in creating some of it, and he had professional access to vulnerable children. At that point, the risk of waiting became too great. Police decided they had to arrest him, but they faced another problem. Digital evidence can disappear quickly. A suspect can shut down devices, trigger encryption, destroy storage, or lock investigators out of critical systems. Officers believed they needed to seize Darren's computer while it was still active. The arrest plan had to be quiet, fast, and precise. One evening, Darren was at home using his laptop. Someone knocked gently on his front door. He got up and walked away from the computer without closing it. When he opened the door, no one was immediately visible. He stepped outside. Officers moved in. Marcus and the arrest team restrained him and informed him that he was under arrest. Darren appeared stunned. He said very little. As the reason for the raid became clear, officers later said he seemed to withdraw into himself. Inside the home, investigators found the laptop still running. It was connected to external storage. Specialist cybercrime officers moved quickly to preserve the system and access the data. The device used encryption, but investigators were able to overcome the protection. What they found confirmed the scale of the case. The computer and connected drives contained an enormous collection of illegal child exploitation material. Police also recovered a compact digital camera, matching the model connected to much of the site's content. The evidence against Darren was becoming overwhelming, but investigators still faced one of the hardest parts of the operation: identifying the victims. Task Force Argos compared images with records from child protection organizations and charities where Darren had worked or volunteered. It was slow and emotionally exhausting. Investigators reviewed files, photographs, placements, and periods of contact. Eventually, they identified several children whose records matched victims shown in the material. Marcus later said the team was confident about the children they had identified. What haunted him was the possibility that there were others. They could not be certain they had found everyone. Another piece of evidence came from handwriting. Some offenders who create illegal material include handwritten notes intended to prove authorship, establish a username, or demonstrate that the material is original. Investigators found multiple images containing handwritten messages. They compared those samples with writing recovered from Darren's home. The match was strong. The tiny Freckle linked his body to the images. The camera linked his equipment to the material. The handwriting linked his personal writing to the content. The computer linked him to the site. His work history linked him to vulnerable children. And victim records linked real children in his care to the evidence. The case was no longer built on one clue. It was built on many independent pieces that reinforced one another. Once Darren understood how much evidence police had, he offered to cooperate. Marcus accepted. But investigators were not interested only in a confession. They already believed they had enough evidence to secure a severe sentence. What they wanted most was information that could help identify victims who had not yet been named and offenders who had not yet been caught. During interviews, Darren provided a few names. Then he claimed he could not remember many of the others. Investigators were frustrated. There were far more unidentified children than the number he was willing or able to name. They also questioned him about the hidden website he had operated. Darren tried to minimize his direct involvement in abuse, but some of his answers disturbed even experienced investigators. Officers said he spoke about the size and influence of the online collection with a strange sense of pride. After one interview, several members of the team reportedly sat quietly together, struggling to process the scale of what they had heard. Further interviews convinced Marcus that Darren was highly manipulative and calculated. He believed Darren chose victims carefully. In Marcus's view, Darren preferred children who were less able to describe what had happened or report it effectively. The officer believed that as soon as Darren thought a child might be capable of exposing him, he would avoid taking further risks with that child. Marcus had no doubt about one thing: if police had not stopped him, he believed Darren would eventually have harmed more children. Maybe not immediately, maybe after waiting for another opportunity, but in the officer's judgment, the pattern would have continued. Darren was ultimately sentenced to decades in prison, with a very long period before he could become eligible for release. Later, the sentence was reduced slightly after he provided information that helped authorities identify and capture another prolific offender overseas. That reduction angered the father of one of Darren's victims. The father told a journalist that he did not believe Darren had shown genuine remorse. He said the children would live with the consequences for the rest of their lives, while the offender still received food, shelter, and the protections of the prison system. His message was simple: people who harm children should stop centering themselves and start thinking about the lives they have damaged. The judge who granted the limited sentence reduction also made an important point. Darren's cooperation had not been complete. The judge suggested that Darren still appeared to be withholding information about serious matters. Because of that, the court gave him only a modest reduction, rather than the larger benefit that cooperating offenders sometimes receive. The judge also questioned whether Darren's remorse was genuine. Darren later claimed that he regretted what he had done and wanted to continue helping authorities. But investigators and victims' families had reasons to doubt his motives. Was he cooperating because he truly understood the harm he had caused, or because cooperation might improve his own situation? No outsider can know with certainty, but one old comment attributed to Darren on the Hidden Sites message board gave investigators a chilling glimpse into the beliefs he had once expressed openly. The message suggested that abusing children should be socially accepted. 5 words cannot explain an entire person, but in the context of the evidence, the victims, the website, and the years of calculated behavior, the comment was difficult to dismiss. This case is remembered not only because of the scale of the crimes, but because of how investigators found the person behind them. A username, a writing style, a vehicle photograph, a license plate, a camera model, a handwriting sample, and one tiny freckle beside a fingernail. None of those clues seemed powerful on its own. Together, they formed a chain strong enough to identify a hidden offender and help dismantle a major international network. It is also a reminder of something important about complex investigations. Breakthroughs do not always come from dramatic confessions or spectacular technology. Sometimes they come from patience, from comparing one small detail against another, from one investigator noticing what thousands of other people might have overlooked. And in this case, that careful attention helped authorities reach children who needed protection and stop a man they believed would otherwise have continued causing harm. There is one more story, and this one begins not with a confirmed crime scene, but with a rumor. A terrifying rumor started spreading through fringe internet forums and then moved into more mainstream social platforms. A mysterious group claiming to be armed militants announced that they had captured several fighters connected to a terrorist organization. The group said they planned to abuse and eventually kill the captives during a live broadcast hidden somewhere on the dark web. They posted a crude website containing a dramatic statement. The language was designed to shock. The group claimed it was operating in a war zone, promised an interactive event, and suggested that the violence would escalate until the captives were dead. The site used the term Red Room. Almost immediately, people across online communities began counting down to the supposed broadcast. The audience grew rapidly, but most of the people watching the story unfold were not necessarily there because they wanted to see someone die. Many were there because they were curious. They wanted proof. For years, internet folklore had described secret places on the dark web where wealthy or anonymous viewers could pay to watch live torture, murder, and other atrocities. These supposed spaces became known as red rooms. To understand why the rumor spread so quickly, it helps to understand what the dark web actually is. The dark web is not a magical second internet buried beneath the ordinary one. It is a collection of services that are intentionally hidden from standard search engines and usually require specialized software to access. Privacy tools can make it difficult to identify the physical location of a website or the identity of its users. That anonymity has legitimate uses. Journalists, dissidents, whistleblowers, and people living under authoritarian governments can use privacy networks for protection. But the same technology can also attract criminals who want to hide illegal activity. Because of that, the dark web became fertile ground for myth. Stories circulated about secret fight clubs where people battled to the death. Other rumors described cruel experiments performed for paying spectators. Some claimed that victims were transformed into so-called living dolls through prolonged abuse. But among all those legends, red rooms became the most famous. According to the myth, a red room is a live, interactive broadcast in which viewers watch a captive being tortured or killed, and may even pay to influence what happens. The more frightening version of the legend suggests that victims are selected in advance, and that wealthy viewers can request specific acts. It sounds like something designed for a horror movie, and that may be part of the point. An Australian journalist, whom we'll call Evelyn Hart, spent years researching hidden online communities, dark web markets, internet folklore, and the stories people tell about them. She said one of the most common questions people asked was whether there was a deeper level of the dark web where the truly horrifying material existed. Her answer was blunt. The secret layer people imagine is largely a myth. That does not mean terrible crimes have never been shared through hidden networks. They have. Law enforcement has investigated child exploitation, drug trafficking, fraud, kidnapping, extortion, and other serious offenses connected to dark web services. There have also been notorious cases in which offenders distributed filmed abuse to paying audiences. But that is different from proving that a fully interactive red room, in the classic urban legend sense, actually exists. Evelyn's question was simple. If these rooms were common enough to be a known underground industry, why had major law enforcement agencies never produced clear public evidence of one? Why had there been no verified screenshots, no confirmed server seizures, no proven payment records, no known victims tied to a genuine interactive execution platform? The absence of evidence did not prove impossibility, but it did make the popular stories difficult to accept at face value. To understand how the legend grew, we also have to look at internet culture. Around the same era that Red Room stories became popular, short online horror fiction exploded across forums and social media. People copied and shared frightening stories designed to look like personal experiences, leaked documents, police reports, or recovered messages. Some of those fictional characters and stories became enormously famous. One tall, faceless figure from online horror folklore, for example, became so popular that the character inspired films, documentaries, games, and real-world controversy. A large online community called No Sleep became one of the best-known homes for this kind of storytelling. The basic idea was unusual. Writers posted fictional horror stories, but everyone in the community was encouraged to behave as though the stories were real. At first, readers often asked whether a particular story had actually happened. Other users would answer that it was probably fiction. Then moderators began enforcing a rule that changed the culture of the community. Participants were expected to remain in character. Comments openly calling a post fake, fictional, or merely a story were discouraged or removed. That might sound restrictive. Instead, the community became even more popular. Millions of users seemed to enjoy the shared suspension of disbelief. For a few minutes while reading, they could pretend the impossible might be true. That same psychological impulse helps explain the power of Red Room legends. People do not always believe these stories because the evidence is strong. Sometimes they believe because the idea is compelling. Terrifying, yes, but compelling. The possibility that there might be a hidden door somewhere on the internet, leading to something forbidden and unimaginably dark, is almost irresistible to human curiosity. A British hacker, using the nickname Cthulhu, once claimed to have investigated several supposed Red Room websites. He said the sites looked ominous from the outside. They promised live violence. They demanded large payments. They used countdown timers. They warned visitors that once the event began, there would be no turning back. But when the hacker examined the technical infrastructure, he found something surprising. The security was poor. For criminal organizations supposedly running the darkest live broadcasts on the internet, the websites appeared remarkably amateur. He dug deeper. His conclusion was that the sites were scams. The pattern was simple. Visitors paid for access. A countdown appeared. The timer reached 0. Then the page failed, displayed an error, showed a blank screen, or delivered something completely unrelated to the promised horror. The operators disappeared with the money. The supposed militant Red Room followed a similar pattern. The group had promised extreme violence against captured terrorist fighters. People waited for the live stream. When it finally appeared, the result was bizarre. After a long period in which almost nothing happened, viewers saw a clean and apparently unharmed prisoner being force-fed cooked bacon. The promised execution never occurred. The site later displayed a message claiming it had been seized in a law enforcement operation. The notice itself appeared amateur and suspicious. Soon, a similar site appeared. It too turned out to be a farce. These incidents strengthened the argument that Red Rooms were mostly scams, pranks, performance art, or internet folklore. But the legend did not disappear. At one point, 2 teenage boys in Italy were reportedly investigated after authorities suspected that they had paid for access to a site presented as an online execution room. The investigation described a platform with chats, rooms, blogs, and marketplaces containing deeply disturbing material. The teenagers were reportedly not ultimately charged in connection with the suspected access. The case did not prove that a genuine interactive execution room existed, but it showed that at least some law enforcement agencies were willing to take the possibility seriously enough to investigate. That should not be surprising. The idea of a Red Room did not begin with Tor. It did not even begin with the internet. For more than a century, writers and filmmakers have used the phrase Red Room to describe spaces associated with fear, secrecy, punishment, violence, or forbidden behavior. A famous 19th century writer used the title for a supernatural short story about a haunted chamber in an old castle. Decades later, the phrase appeared in books connected to haunted houses. It was later used in popular fiction to describe a private room associated with adult sexual fantasy. A Japanese horror film also used the title for a story built around escalating cruelty among people trapped in a deadly game. By the time the internet adopted the phrase, Red Room already carried a long cultural history. It sounded dangerous before anyone ever connected it to the dark web. That cultural history matters because legends rarely appear from nowhere. They borrow familiar fears. A locked room, a hidden audience, a helpless victim, anonymous strangers watching from a distance, a secret society with enough money and power to do whatever it wants. The internet simply modernized the setting. Instead of a haunted castle, the room became a hidden website. Instead of a masked aristocrat, the villain became an anonymous user behind encryption. Instead of a whispered rumor in a village, the story spread through forums, message boards, videos, and social media. The technology changed. The fear stayed the same. So, do real red rooms exist? There is no publicly verified evidence proving the existence of a commercial, interactive, dark web service that routinely live streams executions to paying viewers in the way the legend describes. That does not mean humans are incapable of broadcasting real violence. Sadly, history proves otherwise. People have filmed crimes. They have live-streamed attacks. They have distributed abuse. They have used online platforms to glorify cruelty. The question is narrower. Is there a hidden industry of organized pay-per-view, interactive execution rooms operating exactly like the stories claim? The available evidence remains extremely weak. Most examples collapse under scrutiny. Some are scams. Some are hoaxes. Some are fictional storytelling. Some are recycled videos, falsely presented as live events. Some exist only as screenshots, with no verifiable origin. Others rely on second-hand claims from people who cannot produce evidence. And yet the legend survives. Why? Because uncertainty is powerful. The dark web is difficult for most people to understand. Its hidden services are unfamiliar. Its addresses look strange. Its communities can disappear quickly. And because real crimes do occur there, the false stories borrow credibility from the true ones. A person hears that law enforcement shut down a hidden drug market. That is real. They hear that investigators dismantled a child exploitation network. That is real. Then they hear that somewhere nearby, in the same invisible digital world, there is a live execution room. The third claim feels believable because the first two were true. That is how myths attach themselves to reality. The most unsettling thing about red rooms may not be whether one has already existed. It may be the fact that millions of people now understand the concept instantly. The legend has entered the collective imagination, and human beings have a long history of turning imagined ideas into real behavior. Technology often begins as fiction. So do social trends. So do crimes. An idea can circulate for years before someone decides to imitate it. That means the responsible response is neither blind belief nor careless dismissal. We should not treat every terrifying rumor as fact. Doing so spreads panic, rewards scammers, and can direct attention away from real victims and real crimes. But we also should not assume that something is impossible simply because it first appeared as fiction. The better approach is evidence, verified sources, confirmed investigations, technical records, court documents, identified victims, real arrests, real prosecutions. Those things matter more than screenshots, anonymous posts, countdown timers, and dramatic claims. The dark web is frightening enough without inventing things that cannot be proved. Real hidden networks have enabled serious crimes. Real investigators have spent years identifying victims and tracking offenders. Real families have suffered. When myths become more sensational than facts, they can actually make those real cases harder to understand. And maybe that is the final paradox of the Red Room legend. People search for the darkest possible secret because they want to know how bad the hidden internet can become. But the confirmed truth is already disturbing enough. Human cruelty does not need a mythical chamber to exist. It does not need a mysterious red screen or a countdown clock. It appears wherever people believe anonymity will protect them from consequences. And the strongest defense against it is not fear. It is careful investigation, responsible technology, public awareness, and the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads. Taken together, these stories are unsettling for very different reasons. The first asks, what happens when law enforcement enters a criminal world so deeply that investigators temporarily become part of the machinery they are trying to stop? The second asks where society should draw the line between horrifying fantasy and criminal intent. The third shows how patient investigative work can expose an offender who believed anonymity, technology, and professional trust would protect him. And the fourth reminds us that fear itself can become a kind of currency online, especially when rumor and reality are difficult to separate. Each story revolves around a different kind of hidden space, a hidden website, a hidden fantasy life, a hidden identity, a hidden legend. But none of those hidden spaces stayed completely hidden forever. That may be the most important point. Secrecy can delay accountability. It can make harm harder to detect. It can confuse the people closest to a situation. It can create the illusion that actions have no consequences. But secrecy is rarely perfect. A server leaves records. A search leaves traces. A restricted database logs access. A photograph contains details. A writing style repeats itself. A tiny physical feature appears where someone forgot to hide it. A frightened partner notices that something is wrong. An investigator asks one more question. A court reviews what another court decided. A journalist keeps digging after everyone else has moved on. Truth often emerges slowly, through small pieces rather than one dramatic revelation. That is why responsibility matters so much. Technology itself is not automatically good or bad. Privacy tools can protect vulnerable people, journalists, and ordinary citizens. The same tools can also be abused by offenders. Online communities can give lonely people support. They can also reinforce destructive obsessions. Law enforcement powers can protect victims. They can also raise serious questions when investigators stretch legal boundaries. The lesson is not that privacy is dangerous, that the internet is evil, or that every disturbing thought makes someone a criminal. Life is more complicated than that. The deeper lesson is that choices matter. What we repeatedly choose to watch, encourage, share, normalize, excuse, or act upon can shape the direction of our lives. A thought is not the same as an action, but actions often begin with choices. The choice to keep going, the choice to involve another person, the choice to misuse access, the choice to ignore a warning, the choice to speak up, the choice to ask for help, the choice to stop, the choice to protect someone who cannot protect themselves. Those choices can move a life toward harm or away from it. Claire's story is a powerful example. She did not immediately know what her husband's private world meant. She questioned herself. She hoped his explanation might be enough. She wanted to believe that honesty and therapy could repair what was broken. But when she saw information that made her believe she and others could be in danger, she acted. She removed herself and her child from the situation. She sought help. Whatever anyone thinks about the legal outcome of Adrian's case, Claire's decision to take her fear seriously was understandable. There is a lesson in that for all of us. We do not have to wait until danger becomes undeniable before we protect ourselves. Concern does not require panic. Caution does not require hatred. Seeking help does not require us to know every answer. Sometimes, the wisest thing we can do is create distance, speak to someone trustworthy, and let qualified people assess what we cannot safely evaluate alone. The Australian investigation offers a different lesson. Progress came from patience. The decisive clue was not dramatic. It was tiny, a mark beside a fingernail. Yet that small detail mattered because someone paid attention. In life, we often imagine that important change arrives through huge gestures. Sometimes it does, but more often, it comes from careful work that nobody sees. One person checks the record again. One person compares two images. One person notices an inconsistency. One person refuses to dismiss a concern. Quiet responsibility can save lives. The first investigation also teaches something uncomfortable. Good goals do not automatically make every method good. Stopping dangerous people is important. Protecting children is important. Rescuing victims is important. But the rule of law matters too. When authorities are given power, limits exist for a reason. Those limits protect everyone. At the same time, investigators sometimes face situations where every available option carries risk. There may be no perfect decision. That does not mean we stop asking hard questions. It means we should be humble enough to examine both results and methods. A successful outcome does not erase ethical concerns. An ethical concern does not erase the lives that were protected. Maturity sometimes means holding two uncomfortable truths at once. The Red Room legend offers another kind of warning. Curiosity is human. We are drawn to mystery. We want to know what is behind the locked door. We want proof that the unbelievable is real. But curiosity without judgment can make us easy to manipulate. Scammers understand that. Propagandists understand that. People who create shocking content understand that. The more frightened or fascinated we are, the less likely we may be to stop and ask for evidence. That is why skepticism is not cynicism. Healthy skepticism is a form of protection. It asks simple questions. Who is making this claim? What evidence supports it? Can that evidence be verified? Is there a reliable source? Could someone benefit from making me afraid? Those questions matter online, but they also matter in everyday life. And beneath all four stories is one principle that deserves to be said clearly. Children and vulnerable people deserve protection, dignity, and a chance to live without being treated as objects for someone else's power, profit, obsession, or entertainment. No technology, fantasy, institution, or excuse changes that. When harm occurs, accountability matters. So does prevention. So does compassion for survivors. And so does the difficult work of building systems where people feel safe enough to report concerns before more damage is done. Forgiveness is also part of many conversations about justice. But forgiveness should never be confused with pretending nothing happened. Real forgiveness, when it is possible, does not erase responsibility. It can exist alongside consequences. It can exist alongside boundaries. It can exist without forcing victims to restore trust that has been broken. People can change. Second chances can matter. But a second chance becomes meaningful only when it is joined by honesty, accountability, and a sincere effort not to repeat the harm. That is true far beyond criminal cases. All of us make choices that affect other people. Most of those choices will never appear in court. They happen at home, at work, in private conversations, and in moments when nobody is watching. Character is often built there, in the quiet decisions, in what we do with trust, in whether we use power to protect or exploit, in whether we tell the truth when a lie would be easier, in whether we step forward when someone needs help, in whether we take responsibility after causing harm. We cannot control every dark corner of the world. We cannot know every thought in another person's mind. We cannot prevent every bad decision. But we can choose what kind of person we want to be when difficult choices arrive. We can choose kindness without becoming naive. We can choose caution without becoming cruel. We can choose justice without losing our humanity. We can choose to listen when someone says they are afraid. We can choose to protect the vulnerable. We can choose not to spread rumors simply because they are shocking. We can choose to value truth over entertainment when real lives are involved. And we can remember that strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength is walking away. Sometimes it is speaking up. Sometimes it is admitting we were wrong. Sometimes it is setting a boundary. Sometimes it is asking for help. Sometimes it is doing the right thing quietly, with no audience and no reward. Hey friends, thank you for listening. Turn on notifications if you would like to hear future narrations when they are released. News stories and live conversations are shared regularly throughout the week. If you have a story you would like to submit, you can send it through the community page mentioned in the description, and it may be considered for a future narration. You can also support the channel through those membership and supporter options listed below, where early access and bonus content may be available. And be sure to check out the podcast for longer compilations you can listen to wherever you normally enjoy podcasts. All the relevant links are in the description. Thank you again for spending this time with me. And before we end, remember this. A meaningful life is not built by being perfect. It is built by paying attention to the choices we make, especially when those choices affect someone more vulnerable than we are. Kindness does not mean ignoring consequences. Justice does not require us to lose compassion. Responsibility does not end when we say we are sorry. And forgiveness, when it comes, does not erase the need to learn. We all carry thoughts, fears, regrets, and mistakes that other people may never see. What defines us most is not every passing thought that enters our minds. It is what we choose to do next. Choose carefully, choose honestly, and whenever you can, choose the path that leaves another person's dignity intact. That kind of choice may not make headlines, but it can change a life